Get out! The millionaire screamed. But the barefoot black boy did what millions of dollars couldn't. The golden lights of the Hampton estate glowed like something out of a dream that most people only see in movies. Expensive champagne clinked against hand-blown crystal glasses imported from Venice. Men in perfectly tailored Italian suits laughed loudly about deals, investments, and golf scores. Women in designer gowns smiled the kind of smiles that take years of practice to perfect. The warm smell of roasted filet, mignon, and truffle butter drifted through the evening air like a promise. The kind of promise only the very wealthy could afford to keep. It was Harold Whitmore's 75th birthday celebration, and nobody, not in the state of Connecticut, not in the entire northeastern United States, threw a party quite like Harold Whitmore. Harold had built his fortune the old-fashioned way, ruthlessly, relentlessly, and without apology, starting with a single rundown apartment building in New Haven. At the age of 24, he had clawed his way to the top of the real estate world over 5 brutal decades. He had crushed competitors without losing sleep. He had negotiated contracts that left grown men in tears across the table. He had bought struggling companies for pennies and sold them for fortunes. He had donated just enough to charity to keep his name carved into the sides of hospitals and university buildings, and just enough to keep his conscience from screaming too loudly at night. Harold Whitmore was the kind of man that people feared deeply and respected enormously at the same time. The kind of man who had spent his entire life confusing those two things for love. But for the last 3 years, Harold Whitmore had not been able to walk. A progressive degenerative spinal condition had slowly, quietly, mercilessly stolen the use of his legs. It had started as occasional numbness, then weakness. Then one morning he had simply stood up from his desk, and his legs had given out beneath him like 2 columns of sand. Since that day he had fought back the only way he knew how, with money. The world's finest neurologist had been flown in from Germany, Japan, Switzerland, and South Korea. He had undergone experimental stem cell procedures in private clinics in Zurich that were not yet approved anywhere in the United States. He had tried cutting-edge spinal decompression surgeries in Tokyo performed by doctors whose waiting lists stretched 2 years. He had hired a full-time team of physical therapists, acupuncturists, and rehabilitation specialists who lived in a guest wing of his estate and worked with him 6 days a week. By his own proud and bitter count, Harold Whitmore had spent well over $4 million trying to fix himself. Not $1 had worked. And so tonight, on his 75th birthday, Harold sat at the head of the beautifully decorated outdoor terrace in his sleek, black motorized wheelchair, surveying his guests, his estate, his empire, like a king who had lost the one thing no amount of money could buy back, his freedom. Part 2, The Boy at the Gate. It was exactly 8:47 in the evening when the boy appeared. He came from the far edge of the garden, slipping quietly through a gap in the iron gate that separated the Whitmore estate from the long, tree-lined public road outside. He was no older than 10 years old. His clothes told a story before he ever opened his mouth. A faded olive green jacket that was at least 2 sizes too big, jeans worn thin and frayed at both knees, and bare feet that had clearly walked a very long way on very hard ground. His skin was dark and smooth. His eyes were large, quiet, and completely, almost unnervingly, calm for a child who had just wandered into a billionaire's birthday party uninvited. One of the security guards spotted him immediately and moved toward him with a firm hand outstretched.
"Hey, kid!"
"Stop right there. This is private property. You cannot be here." But the boy didn't flinch. He didn't look at the security guard. He didn't look at the guests who had begun to turn and stare, with expressions ranging from amusement to irritation. He looked past all of it, past the flower arrangements and the champagne towers, and the string quartet playing softly in the corner, and locked his gaze directly, unwaveringly, on Harold Whitmore. "Sir," the boy said. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the terrace with a clarity that cut right through the music and conversation. "I can help you." The entire terrace went silent. For a moment nobody moved. Then Harold Whitmore let out a laugh, and it was not a kind one. It was the sharp, hollow laugh of a man who has been disappointed so many times by so many people that mockery has become his first language. "Help me?" Harold repeated, his voice rich with contempt. "Son, I have paid millions to doctors. The absolute best in the entire world. Harvard-trained, Nobel-nominated men and women who have written the textbooks that other doctors study." He raised one long, weathered finger and pointed it directly at the boy. "And not a single one of them, not one, could do anything for me." His voice dropped lower, harder. "So I strongly suggest you turn around, walk back out through that gate, and get out of here before I have you removed from this property." Some of the guests laughed nervously. Others looked away, suddenly very interested in their champagne glasses. The woman in the elegant green dress took a slow, deliberate sip and said nothing. The boy did not move. He stood there on the stone terrace with his bare feet and his too big jacket. And he looked at Harold Whitmore with those calm, steady eyes, and he said, "I'm not a doctor, but I know what's wrong with you." Part 3. Ancient Wisdom. The laughter died completely. Harold stared at the child. There was something deeply unsettling about the boys. Stillness, no performance. No fear, no nervousness, just absolute, unshakable certainty. The kind of certainty that doesn't come from arrogance. The kind that comes from somewhere much older and much quieter than arrogance. "My grandmother was a healer," the boy said, stepping forward slowly. "Back in our village in Ghana, people came to her from all over, people the hospitals had given up on. She used her hands, pressure points, old knowledge passed down through generations." He paused. "She taught me everything she knew before she passed." A man somewhere in the back of the crowd snorted quietly. Someone else whispered something dismissive, but Harold hadn't taken his eyes off the boy. "She always said," Kofi continued, his voice never wavering, "that the body stops moving when the spirit is carrying too much weight, not always because of a broken bone or a damaged nerve. Sometimes, most times, it's because of what the person is holding inside. The grief they never released, the guilt they buried, the loneliness they covered with success." The terrace was absolutely silent now, because those words, simple, plain, spoken by a barefoot child, and had landed somewhere deep inside Harold Whitmore, in a place he had locked away so thoroughly that he had almost forgotten it existed, in the place where a young, frightened man from New Haven had decided 60 years ago that feelings were weaknesses, and that if he just worked hard enough and earned enough and built enough, he would finally be safe. Harold's jaw tightened. His hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair. "She also taught me the pressure points," Kofi added quietly. "The specific ones that unlock nerve pathways the body has shut down to protect itself." The silence stretched for a long, long moment. Then Harold Whitmore said something that made every single person on that terrace catch their breath. "All right," he said. "Show me." Part 4. What money could never buy. Kofi walked forward without hesitation. He knelt down beside the wheelchair on the stone terrace. This 10-year-old boy in torn jeans and bare feet, kneeling beside one of the wealthiest men in America, and placed both of his small hands on Harold's body. One hand rested gently on the lower spine. The other pressed lightly just below the left hip. Then he closed his eyes. The crowd watched in absolute silence. Several people had their phones out. Nobody spoke. The string quartet had long since stopped playing. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then Harold's breathing changed. It was subtle. The kind of thing you might miss if you weren't paying close attention. A small, slow release, like a man who had been carrying a heavy bag on one shoulder for 3 years and had suddenly, without realizing it, set it down. His shoulders dropped half an inch. The permanent tension around his jaw softened just slightly. "What are you doing?" Harold whispered. "Listening," Kofi said, eyes still closed, hands perfectly still. Another full minute passed. Then Kofi shifted his hands to Harold, his knees pressing both thumbs with careful, deliberate precision at 2 specific points. One on the inside of each knee, just below the joint. He murmured something softly under his breath. It wasn't English. It was something older. Something that seemed to come from a place far away and long ago. And then Harold Whitmore moved his right leg. It was not a dramatic explosion. There was no flash of light, no thunderclap, no cinematic swell of music. It was just a slow, trembling, undeniable, real movement, the movement of a leg, that 3 years of the world's most expensive medical treatment had declared functionally beyond recovery. A woman screamed. A champagne glass shattered on the stone. 3 people stood up at the same time. Harold's personal assistant grabbed the table with both hands, like the earth had shifted beneath her feet. Harold looked down at his own leg. His face, and that hard, controlled, fearless, powerful face that had stared down boardrooms and courtrooms and the United States federal government, completely fell apart. "How?" he whispered. It wasn't even a question. It was something beyond questions. Kofi looked up at him with those calm eyes. "My grandmother always said, and the richest man in the room is usually the most starved. Not for money, not for success," he paused, "for someone to actually see him." And Harold Whitmore, for the first time in longer than he could remember, wept. Part 5, Standing Up. It took another 25 minutes of Kofi's quiet, precise, unhurried work. But by the end of it, Harold had gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, planted both feet on the stone terrace, and stood, shakily, slowly, with 2 guests rushing forward to support him on either side, but standing, on his own 2 feet, in front of every person who had ever doubted, feared, respected, or loved him. The applause that followed was not the polished, rehearsed kind that rich people offer at galas and charity dinners. It was raw and uncontrolled and real, the kind that happens when people witness something they cannot explain, and feel it anyway. Harold stood there trembling, tears still wet on his face, and looked down at this barefoot boy from Ghana, who had walked in off the road and done in 40 minutes what $4 million had failed to do in 3 years. "What's your name?" Harold asked, his voice rough. "Kofi." "Where is your family, Kofi?" "My mother cleans houses nearby. I was walking home from the bus stop when I saw the lights." Harold was quiet for a long time. Then he turned to his assistant and spoke 4 words. 4 words that nobody in 40 years of working with Harold Whitmore had ever heard him say in a professional setting. "Take care of him." Epilogue. What came after? What happened next became one of those quiet stories that begins in a neighborhood and ends up changing lives in ways nobody could have predicted. Harold Whitmore fully funded Kofi's education, beginning with the finest private school in Connecticut and ending 14 years later with a full scholarship to study integrative medicine at Johns Hopkins University. He purchased a proper home for Kofi's mother. He established a monthly living allowance for the family that removed every financial worry they had ever carried. He also endowed a wellness center in Hartford, a real, functioning, medically staffed facility that combined traditional African healing practices with modern Western medicine. He named it after Kofi's grandmother. The medical community studied Harold's recovery carefully. Neurologists published papers about it. The consensus was a combination of psychosomatic stress release, targeted pressure point stimulation, and triggered nerve response activation. The language was clinical and precise, and completely failed to capture what had actually happened on that terrace. Harold himself continued formal physical therapy, properly supervised, fully documented, medically approved. He walked with a cane for the rest of his life and never once complained about it. But whenever anyone asked him, in interviews and speeches, in the quiet conversations that happened between old men near the end of their lives, what had actually healed him, Harold always gave the same answer. "A boy with no shoes and no fear walked in off the street and saw me. Really saw me. For the first time in 50 years, somebody looked straight through everything I had built and saw the frightened man underneath it. And the moment I felt that, truly felt it, my body decided it was finally safe enough to heal." And somewhere across the Atlantic Ocean, in a small village in Ghana, there is a photograph on a wall of an old woman with kind eyes and strong hands. Her name was Abina, and she always knew her grandson had been paying attention.